Occasionally, I don't mind a bit of a sweat. Hell, I don't even mind the sweats themselves. After all, wanting to win isn't inherently a bad thing, but sometimes a line can be drawn between what is fun and what is not. Dimensional Sorter was a game that I've had a complicated relationship with in the past, and that past would haunt me, tilt me, and lead to a few mini crash out episodes. And yet, I knew that there was still a good game in here somewhere. My recent experience with Dimensional Sorter was polarizing, to say the least. Not so much from the game itself, but from my own behavior as I played it initially. Some games give you an immediate reality check sometimes, where your skills don't always carry over, or your expectations for the game to settle you in are subverted immediately. I had played it some time ago and somehow brute forced my way through the initial experience, but even then, there were moments where I wasn't sure if I was even enjoying it in the first place, or if I just simply wasn't really in the mood to fully immerse myself into the game, and just played it for the sake of playing. It's a hard line to draw when you play something that gives you frustration through challenges that begin to slowly tilt you, and then you play worse, hit a breaking point, and then you quit. Perhaps you even rage uninstall the game and make an impulsive vow to never play it ever again and even refund it. This is something that I've done with a few games, and in retrospect, it definitely spawned more from resonating anger rather than rational and critical decision making, where I wasn't really thinking about whether I actually hated the game or not, or if I was just having a rough time with the challenge that just ended up tilting me. And sometimes I would get over the cope and decide to give the game another chance, because a part of me would realize that I would be lying if I said that I never had any fun in the first place. Well, with Dimensional Sorter, I ultimately found myself having fun with the game once I finally began to understand the kind of experience that it's trying to be. You see, the problem sometimes isn't the game, but yourself. And this doesn't exactly disclose the issues that the game may have, but it could also be a case of your mood and your mindset overlapping, and if it's in a negative space, you could then become blind to some of the issues that can easily be resolved by just quickly mood switching to something more open-minded, more progressive and positive, where you can look beyond your own issues and see that the game and its problems sometimes aren't really in the technical or mechanical space, but rather in the way you approach a situation. Your mindset affects how you do everything, and I mean literally everything. In games and in life, they generally overlap. So when I treated this game like any other game, I was punished for it by being frequently overwhelmed by its enemies and would wound up getting slaughtered, leading to a premature end to the run. Some games, especially ones like Dimensional Sorter, sets a hardcore and fast-paced experience that hinges on constant movement and regular life support by getting kills. I didn't really realize that this would be the case when I first discovered the game. I went in expecting something like Ultrakill since it was marketed as such, and because I wanted more games like it. It was the same kind of search looking for games like Dark Souls, where there was a time when there wasn't that many, and it was the same after Doom 16 and Doom Eternal. But nowadays, we have so many in each camp. Souls-likes, boomer shooters, and movement shooters. These are games that are in droves now. We have so many of them that we can just pick one over the other. And this makes it easier to find a like-minded experience. In the case of games like Ultrakill at the time of when I first discovered Dimensional Sorter, the only other alternatives I could think of were games like Reaver and Voidborn. As I said, Dimensional Sorter would be the first Ultrakill-like experience I picked, and I went in assuming it would be as such, but then would realize over time that it's not necessarily like Ultrakill, because in quite a few other ways, the game is its own beast. With Ultrakill, it combined the fast-paced verticality and frantic combat of games like 2016 and Doom Eternal, and combined it with player expression and stylistic combos like you would see in character action games like Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, Ninja Gaiden, the earlier God of War games. But this game definitely has more Devil May Cry DNA and Doom mixed together, and it was fantastic. Players initially had the freedom to play how they wanted, but to realize further gameplay mechanics and movement tech, they would then have to be sold on the gameplay first to explore and experiment with what was possible, with ranks being an incentive to do it, as well as the skill checks that would come in later as the acts got more complex and more difficult. The game's existence also provided for a new movement of old school style shooters that wanted to be more than just another Doom and Wolfenstein clone, and this is where games like Dimensional Slaughter, Voidborn, and Reaver would come in. Games that were kind of like Ultrakill but would do things very differently that made them unique compared to Ultrakill. And this is something that you will start to notice when you start to play Dimensional Slaughter, where there are mechanics and systems in place that set a different set of ground rules in contrast to, say, Ultrakill's stylistic approach to arena combat. Both games have you run from room to room, clearing the arena, and eventually you end up fighting a boss or a larger arena to then get to the exit. But how these games achieve the objective is somewhat different. In Ultrakill, you have a bunch of tools that you can experiment with and combo with. But in Dimensional Slaughter, you're in a hourglass where the time is running short, and since your health is draining as you wait, you have no other choice but to kill enemies to get health and to move constantly. You can't really explore once the fight begins because you are under constant harassment by the enemies. And when you're not fighting them, you're losing health, and you lose more health as you take damage, and the only way to get it back is by killing enemies and then also using the game's Shocker Punch mechanic to get ammo and health. In Ultrakill, the blood heal mechanic is intrinsically tied to V1's requirement for blood as a fuel source, so you have the story context of V1's need for blood, and you also have it as a healing device to keep you engaged in the loop. In Dimensional Slaughter though, the killing of enemies is more of a mechanical drive to support the time-based gameplay where you are constantly on the move to clear the arena and to get out very quickly. Some other shooters have a similar life drain mechanic. Games like Post Void, Force Reboot, and Mullet Mad Jack, they also have this mechanic that requires the player to move their ass and kill enemies along the way to stay alive, making it more of a time-based shooter where you're racing against the clock before your time runs out and you die. Now with Dimensional Slaughter, it takes the life drain aspect and it gives you all the time you need, technically speaking. In the combat arenas, you can actually fight as long as you want, and the enemies will never stop coming, but once that portal opens, it is in your best interest to get moving as soon as possible before you eventually die. Some occasions, you'll have to go from point A to B before you start losing health. It doesn't always happen, but it will occur at some point. This mechanic also ties into the game's unbelievably sweaty and chaotic approach to the combat. It is brutal, even on the normal difficulty. Normal and expert have you lose health, while the little baby difficulty has you not worry about the mechanic. The enemies do less damage and the power-ups are common. Plus, you also have extra lives. The intended experience seems to be more on the normal difficulty to start off with, and then on expert for those who are confident enough to move onto a more challenging version of the experience. To make things clear once again, this game isn't really like Ultrakill, and if you go in expecting it to be exactly like it, you're going to be disappointed. In saying that, you may find some commonalities such as the sliding mechanic, the double jumping, slamming the ground to get a bigger jump, jumping off of walls, so there are some movement commonalities here, but the movement in Dimensional Slaughter operates on a different kind of gameplay approach that I feel is the opposite to Ultrakill's more open-ended and expressive gameplay style, where you have the time to think about your actions and then you can come up with your own combos in succession to pull off lots of insane, kills, all the while factoring in eventual skill checks that will come into play to see if you're constantly engaging with the game's loop and its mechanics. But Dimensional Slaughter has you engaging with all of the mechanics because they are vital to your survival. The game dedicates itself to the feeling of absolute pressure. The moment that you set in and the enemies start spawning, you're then locked into that small arena where your health is running out and the enemies are immediately on you. And you have to keep killing the enemies to get that health back and to pick up ammo. And like I said, use the Shocker Punch system to get health and ammo. You're literally fighting to stay alive. Whereas in Ultrakill, you kill to clear the arena and you keep yourself alive by using the blood heal system when you need it. But you're not constantly losing health just by existing in the arena. Whereas in Dimensional Slaughter, you have to keep killing and moving to literally stop yourself from dying. It's like if someone cut your hand and then you started bleeding profusely and then you're thrown into an arena and then they tell you that the only way to heal is to keep killing enemies. and then to get out, you have to kill enough enemies to then leave the arena. Dimensional Slaughter is kind of like that, where your character is just, it has like a permanent bleed effect in the arena and is required to constantly kill and annihilate enemies in succession while keeping their health bar up. And on the topic of Ultrakill again, even with the blood heal system in place, a really good Ultrakill player can actually avoid taking damage entirely if they wanted to. There are people that have beaten all of the available levels while P ranking and while not taking any damage whatsoever. So there is a higher level of play possible, but in Dimensional Slaughter, having such a challenge as playing the game without taking any damage, it's impossible because of the mechanics set in place to force the player into this constant loop of killing the enemies to get health and ammo back so they can survive the onslaught until the portal opens so that they can then leave the arena, making the combat, generally speaking, close quarters. Very rarely are you going to have occasions where you'll have some range to work with, because before you know it, they're already onto you. And if some of the ground enemies aren't close enough, some of the aerial enemies will be. I guarantee it. So with this focused loop in place, there is more of a restriction to the way you play it, because going outside of that box and trying to ignore specific mechanics is not only going against the grain, but it also will more than likely lead to your death if you try to do anything beyond its supposed gameplay loop, where it has these things in place where this is what you have, this is what you need to do to stay alive, and the rest is really just sort of up to you to see if you can handle the onslaught. And with the movement, it is in your best interest to slide in order to create some sort of space between you and the enemies, clearing clusters often with the alternate shots for your weapons, landing those shocker punches correctly for the health and ammo, jumping and stomping for vertical positioning, as well as grappling and exposing weak spots on said enemies. Some enemies, you literally have to find a weak spot in order to finish them off. And you do all of this not because you can, but because you absolutely have to. Not moving fast enough will lead you to getting swarmed, and before you know it, you're dead. And then you'll have to start all over again. And that's another thing. The progression in this game has somewhat of a roguelike approach to it. Now, it's said that there are 3 parts. I've only done part 1 and 2, and the second part is unlocked after completing the first. But when you die during the part 1 run, you'll have to restart it all over again from the beginning and go from there. In each of the dimensions you have, you clear an arena, you go through the portals, rinse and repeat the process until you reach the boss, you beat the boss, and that's it for the dimension. You then have the opportunity to select a skill, and you also have the options to either get an extra life or skip upgrades. The maps are very, very fast paced, and I don't just mean in the combat, but in the progression side of things. If you're fast enough, you'll be done in a couple of minutes. They can range from 3 to 5 minutes, and so far I've only experienced 4 dimensions, including the final one in part 1, and 2 master levels that give you additional abilities. There are also secrets that you can unlock, which you can get by finding these panels and punching them. Clearing the level after obtaining all of the secrets leads to another secret level in the game. But even when you're secret hunting, you're still getting lynched by not only the current mob that you're fighting, but all the other mobs from the other dimensions that you've cleared. So if you clear the cultist realm and then go to the garbage world dimension, you'll also be fighting enemies from the cultist realm dimension at the same time. So when you start another run, you'll have to also think about which one to tackle first, since some enemies will generally force you to prioritize them before anyone else. For example, in the aerial entrails dimension where you learn how to grapple, there are these enemies that leech health off of you no matter where you go, and if you want them to stop, you have only one way to kill them, by stomping on their head like it's a Mario game. This is also another example of how the game can somewhat differ from Ultrakill, because in that game, there are multiple ways to dispose of a target generally speaking, but in this game, with some specific enemies, you have no other way to dispose of them other than just using different weapons. And with this particular enemy, you always have to stomp on its head so that it, dies. which also takes me out of the general fight when it happens, because the moment it spawns, it's like, okay, I need to immediately go to this enemy and then stomp on its head so that way I don't keep losing health. Now, in saying that, I'm not going to say outright that the game doesn't have any weapon and movement tech, but there are definitely things that you'll have to constantly do anyways, just for the sake of staying alive. And some games do have that factor in as well, while still having breathing room for more experimentation to take place, whereas this kind of game has more of a focused and fast-paced drive to put you in this like absolute melting pot where you're losing health all the time, enemies are constantly on you. What do you do then? Do you try to experiment a lot, finding different ways to go about it? Or do you just find the most optimal solution possible and do what the game kind of wants you to do? But in saying that, I suppose the question would alter to the likes of, okay, I have this whole run to do in one sequence. What is the most effective and optimal way I can get through all the levels in a single segmented run, rather than constantly redoing one level over and over again where you start to memorize it? So in that sort of sense, thinking of it now, Dimensional sort of definitely has more of a play for performance approach rather than a play for progression approach. And when you play for things like performance and endurance, you then delve more into what the game actually sort of is. And it's a game about endurance, of how much pressure that one player can endure in a single and segmented sort of run. Because you have that stake of losing all of that progress, at least in the first part anyways. So then you have to think, what dimension should I start with? What are the best weapons for dealing with what specific enemies? What kind of clusters can I create? How do I kite better? So that when I'm ready to use the shocker punch, how many enemies can I get in succession, all the while still creating space between me and the enemies? When certain enemies appear, who should I prioritize first? So these sort of questions are raised in the context of, say, a roguelite, where you're not thinking more about how much you can progress, but rather how well you can perform. And if you approach the game through that sort of mindset, you'll see just how much potential the game has in the loop. So when you look on the Steam page, it'll say that it is a mix of Ultrakill, Post-Void, and Risk of Rain 2. And from my experience, I would say that it has the movement and aesthetics of Ultrakill, the time-based intensity and pressure of Post-Void, and the progression-based system of Risk of Rain 2, where as you complete each level, you obtain these upgrades that will then assist during the run, and there are some upgrades that are permanent that will make the next run much easier. Say for instance the diamonds, where these diamonds that you get give you additional mechanics that you can use on top of what you already have, which can make the collection of blood and ammo much easier to get rather than just relying on the shocker punch constantly. Now, my first couple of hours of the game and my initial revisits were very rough, and for the most part, I was having a miserable time with the game, and I would put it down multiple times. But there were other occasions where I would revisit the game with a rebooted and fresh perspective, understanding that I have to sometimes play by the game's rules first to understand what it's trying to do, before I can ascertain whether I actually like the game or not. And luckily, at the end, I finally learned to accept its style of gameplay and was able to enjoy it. This game will not be for everyone, and by the thumbnail you might think that I hate the game. Well, no, I don't hate it. I've certainly been frustrated by it, absolutely. I even had some mini crash out episodes where I had to go touch some grass from time to time, but once I came in with a more open mindset, I was able to have more fun with the game once I finally respected its rules and understood what I was expected to do in order to survive. Also, personal recommendation here, play on a lower field of view. Keep it at 85 or something. Playing it on a higher FOV doesn't really help in this game's case because of how small the arenas are generally, and the fact that the combat is often close quarters. Enemies will always be close to you, and having that high FOV will make it harder to gauge the distance between you and the enemies, so turn it down. Also, you have other color palettes to play with. Some of them look pretty cool, and one is a case of Cruelty Squad gone horribly wrong. You also have a centered view if you're into that sort of thing, and yes, if you're doing it just to say that you can play at 160 field of view if you're insane. So what do I like about the game? Well, the weapons are pretty neat. They have some pretty useful alt-fire modes that can come in clutch for quick heal bursts, and then you have other mechanics that you develop later on, like the grappling hook, the dash, and then the blade that can be used to carve through enemies. But to get those things, you need to clear the first part first, and to do the master levels afterwards to get the sword. Part 2, just as far as I know, has you continue repeated runs while obtaining more upgrades. I've yet to unlock the other diamonds, but there is a randomizer mode that gives you all the weapons and diamonds on top of randomized levels with randomized enemies. The soundtrack is pretty decent, and the atmosphere and set pieces are pretty damn cool. It definitely has an Ultrakill vibe to it, but in a different sort of way. I actually like the idea of having enemies cross over from other dimensions to fight you, because your presence has upsetted the balance in those places, and as a result they want some payback. While the combat isn't as expressive as it is in, say, Ultrakill, due to how focused and linear it is with its, chaotic and frantic sweat-based combat, it is still designed in a way that makes you engage with all of the mechanics, so that you're not playing too comfortably. Playing complacently and not really thinking about what you're doing will absolutely get you killed in this game. Dimensional Sorter isn't about being comfortable, but about being uncomfortable and still being focused, despite the overwhelming pressure. The game at the moment is still incomplete, unfortunately. I don't know exactly if the developer plans to return to it. I hope so though, because what is there is a game that has a lot of potential that can create a unique type of movement shooter experience. A game that combines the vertical and fast-paced movement of Ultrakill, while adding a sweaty and time-based gameplay element found in games like Post Void, as well as polishing further the roguelike aspects found in games like Risk of Rain 2 that is applied in this game. The last update I found was back in 24, and it's now in a state where quite a lot of changes have happened since. If you've unlocked part 2, it creates a checkpoint, so it's now more forgiving if you've gotten to that point, so you don't have to start all over again. There's also a slow-mo system for breathing room, what little there is anyways, and a bunch of other changes. However, it is still in early access, and there's still more to be done. I'm glad that the game finally won me over though, and it's not something that always happens, because when I can't have fun with a game no matter my mindset or what I do, it's generally a lost cause and it's just not for me. In saying that, this game reminded me that sometimes the mind can be fickle, and sometimes a reassessment of one's own mindset can help one see things in a different light, or things that they hadn't noticed before. Dimensional Sorter is a good game once you break past its brutal barrier, but even then, its experience will be a case of make or break. It either hooks you in or spits you out. Definitely give it a chance though. It deserves that much at the very least, and there is also a demo for it. So you've got nothing to lose by giving it a shot. Just don't expect it to be exactly like Ultrakill, because it really isn't. Stay safe everyone, and thanks for watching.